All right. Oh, well, Mark's not here yet. Hi, David. Yay. Oh, you're not here to see me. I get it. Here comes Mark. Oh, dear. Okay. Now that Mark is in the house, and it is 11. Hi, Mark. Welcome. You made it. I'm going to turn things over to our amazing host for Next Generation Breakfast Club, Misha.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second of 4 sessions of Temple's Next Generation Breakfast Club. My name is Misha Pell. I know all of you know who I am, but I'm finishing up my law degree at Western Law, and I'm really excited to be returning as the host of Next Generation's sessions. So today, we're excited to be welcoming Arielle, who's the daughter of David Earn and Sigal Balshine, who's joining us today to discuss Israel, human rights, and the environmental crisis. Arielle is a 2021 graduate of the University of Toronto with a Bachelor of Science in Conservation Biology and as well political science. During her undergrad, she developed a keen interest in the study and application of conservation biology and the intersection of human rights and environmental crises. She's worked as a researcher for Environment and Climate Change Canada at the Rockman Lab at U of T, at McMaster in the Theoretical Biology Lab, and at McGill in the Faculty of Social Work. She's done so much. She recently pursued an internship as a researcher at the Research Center for Socio-Arid Ecology at the Arva Institute for Environmental Studies, where she led a cross-border research project on ecotourism practices and values around the shared border of Jordanians and Israelis in the southern Arva. I can't wait to hear more about the work you're doing, so please take it away.
Thanks, Misha. Hi, everybody. I have a little bit of a presentation to share with you guys today, mishmash of some of the different things I've been up to over the past couple years. And then after, we can just have a discussion. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of the things I've been up to and even things I don't get into so much. So I'll just share my screen and let me know if there's any issues. Here we go. Can everyone see the present? Awesome, I got a thumbs up. So hi again, I'm Arielle, the daughter of Sigal and David, for those of you that don't know me. So I grew up in Hamilton and Anshe Shalom, and I'm now a master's student in Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv University specifically, in anthropology and sociology. And I spent the last 2 years kind of on and off in this region doing a variety of different environmental research and around sort of the environment and politics of these landscapes. And so I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about the different programs that I've done and kind of what led me there. And I'll just kind of, guide you through my experiences. So to give you an overview, I'll let you know a little bit about me, what drew me here in the first place. I'm going to talk about the Arva Institute, which is where I did that internship that Misha just mentioned. It's a research institute in the very, very, very south of Israel. I'm also going to share lots of pictures, so I hope anyone who's been there will be excited to see what it looks like. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about the solidarity and environmental activism I've been doing here over the past couple years that I sort of got involved in during my time there. And also what I'm up to now. So a little bit about my master's, and also I'm sure, as I think most of you are probably aware, it's a bit of a crazy time to be living in Israel. So just like reflecting on that a little bit as well. So my Jewish life, figured I would start here just because it was fun for me to reflect about it as I came back. These are just a slew of Facebook pictures I could find. But I went to Temple Playhouse and Kehila Elementary School, had my bat mitzvah at Temple Anshe Shalom. And I was also like a camper at Camp George for 9 years, like 3 of them I was a staff on the ropes course. And so I really like see this as sort of the time where I really like to find what it meant to be Jewish to me, and sort of like also developed like an interest in Israel and like all sorts of things related to being Jewish. And And then in terms of academia, which has become more and more important to me, when I left Hamilton, I did my bachelor's degree at the University of Toronto. I realized Misha kind of went over this, but I didn't know it would be in the bio, but I'll just repeat it a bit. I studied political science and conservation biology, which is like nice because it gave me a sort of social science and natural science combination that I could apply to specific environmental problems. And so for me, during my undergrad, that was really plastic pollution. So you can see there in this picture, I'm dissecting some fish that had little bits of microplastics inside of its reproductive system. But I also did a lot of work on sort of bigger policy issues related to plastic, specifically in the Great Lakes in that basin. And I was particularly interested in sort of the environmental water quality agreements between the US and Canada. And so I did a lot of work sort of thinking around these agreements and how we can do better at sort of servicing our waterways and stopping all of this pollution. And through that work, also became quite involved with Indigenous communities and sort of their perception of what was going on in terms of like sovereignty and pollution and sort of their rights to the land as well. And so all of these sort of political and environmental interests continued for me, and it brought me here in many ways to do a program, the Arielle Institute, which I'll talk about in a second. And through there, I sort of met professors who recruited me to come back to Israel to do a master's in anthropology and sociology at Tel Aviv University. And kind of my subject of interest is political ecology. And particularly, I'm doing work with cowboys in the Golan Heights. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, although I don't have too much to say since I only moved back here like 3 months ago. And I just really started doing the research. But that's a picture of me from a few weeks ago. It's much colder in the north than in Tel Aviv. So the Arielle Institute, I found the program actually online. It's offered through MASA. If people are familiar, it's a program that brings Jews from Canada and the US to Israel to do a number of different things. And so like they sort of describe themselves as an environmental studies institute that leads environmental studies and research in the Middle East. It does accredited university programs through Ben Gurion University, and it also has a series of research centers that bring interns also from around the world that can focus on a range of environmental issues. Obviously, it's in a very southern and dry climate, the Arava Desert. This is really nearby. It's like just a film picture I have from my time there. But because of that, it also really focuses on kind of climate change and the types of environments that we're going to see more and more of as our climate sort of warms up and dries out in a lot of places in the world, but especially in the Middle East. Oops, sorry. And something really interesting about the program is that it brings together Jordanians, Palestinians, Israelis, and participants from around the world, and offers everyone kind of an opportunity to learn together and to develop skills in environmental cooperation, and kind of has the idea that by bringing people together, we can help solve some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges that really are cross-border. And like my interest in this obviously came from some of my work in the Great Lakes, which has like tons of fresh water and decent sort of cooperation between states, and yet was still so challenging. So I thought, you know, why not go to a desert in the Middle East where you have like conflict and almost no water, and try and sort of tackle these issues in a really different light. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the program because it's such a unique experience, I think. Basically, it's located on Kibbutz Keturah in the Arava Desert, which is south of the Negev. So like really, really, really south. Again, the student body is a third Arab, so that's Palestinian and Jordanian, a third Israeli Jewish, and a third international. And that's not just international Jews, although there's a lot of us. It was also Africans, South Americans, Europeans, some of whom are obviously Jewish, but also some of whom aren't. Also Americans who aren't Jewish as well were there. There's two streams, the internship stream, which is what I was doing, and a student stream. So the student stream, again, has university credits that you can take. And the Research Institute, which is where the interns kind of all lie within, focuses on solving these cross-border environmental problems, and then specifically takes this case study of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and tries to sort of think about solving environmental problems in this case. And the main elements of our program are the academia, so that's either the research or the student life, community building, and peace building, or sort of history and politics. And these are pictures of the region. These are some sand dunes really close to us where some of my friends are just doing really cool things with sand. So the campus itself is on Kibbutz Torah. You can see in this bottom picture, these are kind of like the backyard of the kibbutz, and you kind of just leave the kibbutz gate and hike into the mountains. And this little green area down here is the kibbutz. And when you're on the kibbutz, you see these beautiful sort of red mountains, which are the Jordanian Red Mountains every night. And that's sort of your view of the sunset. The campuses and offices are located inside of the kibbutz. And I mentioned it's a cooperative kibbutz. It's one of the few kibbutzim in Israel that's still cooperative, which makes for quite an interesting experience as well. We live in dorms together throughout the semester, which is 4 months, but I stayed for 2. And I just to like really exaggerate this point, but like it takes about 25 minutes to get to Eilat, but almost 3 hours north to get to, or just over 3 hours north to get to Beersheba. So it's really isolated, and life there moves really slow, which is both difficult, but also unique. Maybe some of you haven't had the chance to visit there, but it's definitely an interesting part of the world. So the Research Institute itself kind of covers a variety of stuff. They do a ton of research into like solar panels and water tech and desert agriculture, like wastewater diplomacy, and also like social and historic contexts of like different environmental issues. So it's like a really interesting sort of mishmash of researchers from the land that kind of do all sorts of stuff. Some of it's cooperation with Jordan, and other stuff is with Palestinian communities, and some of it's just within Israeli society. So it's quite interesting. What I did there for 9 months was basically part of what I was doing, at least, was research into ecotourism. Ecotourism is like kind of self-explanatory, I think, but it's like environmental tourism or ecological tourism that either promotes ecological or sustainable living, or is in some way trying to be environmental. There's not like a singular definition to it. Books are written about how it's not well defined. But basically my research around ecotourism was joint between Jordanians and Israeli scientists. They have like a sort of Middle East Research Institute that does this type of work, and the Jordanians had completed the work, and they asked me to come and sort of finish the Israeli side. And so I got to spend 9 months sort of traveling around and doing tourist activities in the Southern Arava. I interviewed different tourist practitioners at different sites and went on a lot of tours. So if anyone needs Southern Arava tourist advice, I'm really happy to provide it. And also trying to understand like how you can really do environmental tourism or ecotourism in a place that's, you know, lacking so many resources, like that has almost no water and really like needs a lot sort of like shipped in order to function. And so these were some of the controversies I was looking into, but I don't have so many conclusions from that time. It's still research that's ongoing, as it's like a pretty large project with a lot of researchers, but I'm happy to also talk about it more if people have questions. Another big element of my time in this program was community building. It was like often informal, like people hosting acrobalance workshops or cooking over a fire or having iftar Shabbat dinner together. But we also did like more structural things like building gardens in the desert and also building mud structures outside like to cook in, or doing language exchange. And I think this was a really essential part of it and really like forced into the program because again, you have people coming from different sides or parts of a conflict, and like in order to build trust and relationships with each other, sorry, I'm talking kind of fast, you need to kind of have activities that create that trust together. And then I guess a major part of the program was also the sort of political or peace building aspect and really diving into the history of the land. And this we did mostly through dialogue. Once a week, we would sit down for a 3-hour dialogue session with Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals, and we would each have a facilitator from each sort of national or international group. And people would share personal stories about how they grew up, what they experienced. Life is really different where you come from within Israeli communities or within Palestinian communities. And I don't have pictures of us doing that, but I do have pictures of some of the trips we took together where we would get sort of guides from different elements. And we did a lot of also like environmental tours around what happens when you have wastewater coming from a Palestinian community and from an Israeli community, and who has to deal with that waste, and who's gonna take care of that. So kind of all of this was always tied into an environmental framework, because that's also what brought us all here. But I didn't want to take a minute to just mention like what it was like to be in that room as a diaspora Jew, someone from Canada coming in. Even though I had a Jewish education and I have Israeli family and I've done many visits to Israel, I still felt really ignorant about sort of the lived realities of people day to day. I feel like sometimes like the way that Israel was presented to me or the way that I had read about it or known about it was really different than what I heard or experienced from people's own stories of their lives. I definitely didn't really understand who Palestinians were or what that identity was, which maybe is shocking and not everyone's experience, but was definitely mine. And also regarding the occupation, which is, I know, always a touchy subject, but it was something that I had heard about, but I didn't actually understand what it was. And I had never met anyone who had been living under it. And so to really hear stories of what it means to live under military occupation was shocking and also really informative to like better understanding what's really happening today. And the Jewish diaspora group would meet a lot, and we would sort of talk about what this was like for us. How we felt a bit sheltered showing up, thinking that we had a very strong connection to this land without really understanding what was happening today. And we processed a lot of guilt around why we hadn't asked more questions or why we hadn't sort of had more opportunity to have open dialogue about it. And so that's something I thought I might share. The other main thing I really wanted to talk about was my experiences with grassroots activism. During this sort of difficult but also really interesting period, like year of my life, learning all of this stuff, I decided I wanted to like dive into doing like real activism for the first time. And so because we were an environmental institute, me and an Israeli girl and another Jewish international girl from London decided to start a project together around environmental and solidarity activism with a community in Area C of the West Bank, a Palestinian community. I'll talk a little bit about the area just to give some context, but essentially it's famous for nonviolent resistance in the face of dispossession and demolitions. And there's a really long history there of international and Israeli Jewish activism. And specifically, it was actually there that I started to connect with Jews from around the world through the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, who go and do activism there from all over. And it was one of the like more inspiring and moving things I've probably ever experienced in my life. And really started to form a community of people from around the world that shared values that I had as well. And that I think they really feel are rooted in Jewish values. And this picture itself, I'll start to talk about it a bit, but this is sort of the land, the agricultural land we were working with, where you can see some of my friends here. And then right behind these structures, the houses and the water tower here, that's actually a settlement. So we are talking about not distances, but really like the land is on each other. And so it's really different than what I had imagined for sure. So I'm just going to give context on the area. I don't want to go too deep into politics or anything, but basically 60% of the West Bank is designated as Area C. So that's under full Israeli military control and full civil administration by Israeli military. So in Area C, that's where most of the settlement expansion has happened since 1967. And we can see that by these blue dots on the map. Which are the expansion of settlements. And I like to call sort of what's going on in the area when I talk about this as like the 3 S's. It kind of helps me understand how it relates to our project. So first, you have the settlement expansion in Area C. So as the settlements are expanding, taking over more land, they become closer and closer to Palestinian communities that were there before 1967. This creates an artificial or real, in some cases, security threat because of these new created proximities. And this often leads to the army trying to move the Palestinian communities away from the settlements and force them into other localities. And they do this often by destroying wash structures. And so wash structures are like water, sanitation, hygiene. And because they have to request building permits to build these structures again from the military, they don't get building permits. And instead, they're just ordered demolition after demolition order. So what we get is a lot of communities who don't have access to water, sanitation, and hygiene, which is a basic human right, also a basic environmental need and right. The area we were working in specifically, it's called the South Hebron Hills, or Masafer Yatta. It's had quite a lot of news like in the last few years, so maybe people have heard of it. Again, it's in Area C. This is a map of it here. The Palestinian communities were in this region prior to 1967, and in 1980s, the military declared most of the region a firing zone because of sort of the encroaching settlements around the area. A firing zone is sort of an active military zone. I didn't explain that. Shetach Esh in Hebrew. This sort of firing zone and also sort of settlement dynamics basically created a limited access for land cultivation and livestock grazing for most of the communities. And they now rely on tankered water, which means that because of the settlements and because of the military zone, they no longer have access to sort of piped water from the Palestinian Authority, which means that, and they are continuing to face demolitions of these structures. And what's really important to us as an environmental institute, obviously these are human concerns and political concerns, but really the climate crisis is worsening the water crisis due to the increasingly hot and dry summers. So while maybe in the 80s it was okay, today we know everywhere, especially everywhere in the Middle East, things are getting drier and hotter. And what that means is when you don't have enough tanks of water and you don't have access to like a tap of running water, not just your agriculture goes thirsty, but people are thirsty as well. And so here are some pictures of like when I first came to the community. We can see again up in this corner, like this was their agricultural land, which clearly lacks basically any water. They only had one tank to sort of water and this is subsistence farming. They're not selling it. And behind, again, we see the settlement that's lush and green and has a water tower. And again, this is sort of one of the structures that has had their guest house. It's had a number of demolitions on it in the last few years, and they rebuilt it. And then, yeah, on the bottom, we see the community center, which is donated by the United Nations, and I think also EU aid. There's a lot of international activism in the region. So basically, the reason I'm talking about this is because we can see these as things that I'm really interested, which are a form of political ecology, because we see that they're kind of politically produced environmental challenges, right? We can see that the settlement, which is exactly next to it, has much more water and access to green space and all of these things. And so what we see is like a dry desert beside like a lush oasis. The village itself is made up of about 40 families who were expelled from their lands during 1948 in the Negev, and they bought land from a nearby city called Yatta. They still have the deed to the land, and the military has even acknowledged that they know that they own the land. But we still see this complete contrast between sort of the two environmental realities of these communities. And so our project was basically to try and help in some way through our environmental knowledge. We felt like we could bring something special, which was like our bonded sort of group together, and also our environmental expertise in the area. So we aim to address these environmental challenges that the community was facing. Again, they're kind of caught between this sort of military struggle that they didn't ask for, but they can't build and they can't have access to water. So what they need really was new water tanks, and they needed to build a purification system in order to sort of reinvigorate their agricultural fields and be able to irrigate their land. And so these were sort of the goals of our project. We had our first work day where we brought actually 60 participants. We built a water purification system, or began it. We also had compost workshops, and we did greenhouses and began to prepare agricultural fields. We also just enjoyed meals together. These are some pictures from the workday. Again, this was like a very meaningful thing to me, where we brought like a lot of good friends and good people together to do what felt like really important work. This is me actually standing amongst water tanks. So you can see the size of them. They are big, big things that we're bringing. And these are in the bottom, the composts that we were making. So overall, the project is actually still ongoing, which to me is really amazing. Semester after semester at the Institute has taken it over to sort of continue and also continue to sort of facilitate this project in any way they can and visit and help in the fields, and created this sort of longstanding relationship with both activists and the community themselves. And so it's sort of a three-way project with an environmental scope of increasing water availability and increasing food access and sustainable use of resources by using their gray water again, and also creating green space. And it was also led and designed by the community, had really high engagement, as you can see by like all the kids in the pictures who were also participating, and also has increased their economic opportunity because they now do have enough water to start to sell some of their produce to like Yatta. And also a form of solidarity activism, like recognizing that, you know, we see them and that they're there and that they're not like a forgotten part of society, and also that we can channel our resources into these politically targeted or occupied communities through physical presence and just trying to bring our own knowledge and work together. I will say as a final thing about Misafri Yatta, and then I'll move on, is that unfortunately, one of the sad things is that even though the military zone was declared in the 1980s, it's been in battles in the court for over 40 years. And last year during our project, the court did approve by signing with the state that the Palestinian villages will be evicted. And so that has been ongoing for the last year. And like, these are people who I know and, you know, communities that I visited and that I have friends in. And I think it like becomes a lot more real to think about it. And in terms of the history, it is the largest expulsion of people like in this land from 1967. So it is a pretty big thing. And I think I just wanted to mention that. But also I had a really interesting opportunity to travel around the West Bank in general. It wasn't a place I had been before. These are friends of mine running in the Bethlehem Marathon and celebrating Christmas, eating food in like the UN village of Batir, visiting gardens and friends' houses in Jericho and like religious sites around. And I just wanted to also mention that despite all of the stuff I'd said before, that there is also really interesting things to see and amazing people to meet and delicious food to be eaten if you get the chance to visit. And yeah, I don't know how long I've been, but I'm getting to my end now. But now I'm doing a master's at Tel Aviv University. So during my time at the Institute, I met two professors, one of whom is my supervisor now at Tel Aviv University. And they got a big grant to basically do research into shepherding in communities around the Middle East. And they kind of called me when I got back to Canada and said, you know, we have a position for you and we think it would really fit based on your background. So I decided to come back a few months ago and start this program. The actual program is in climate and society, and it's one of the first, I think it's the second international program in the world that's specifically around the social science of climate change, which is really starting to become a much more important field as we understand the connection between humans and nature. And my work is in the Golan Heights, as I mentioned. And so that's with both Druze and Jewish cattle farmers, and understanding that like, it's really these communities on the margins who are, in the case of the Middle East, often shepherding communities that have very intimate knowledge of the climate and how it's changing. And so like, I added this note. The top picture is actually, I'm now realizing, a picture from Tel Aviv that I included. It's not in the north, but we can see on the bottom like how lush it actually looks compared to all the pictures I've been showing you. But there's a huge drought happening in the north, and like to my eyes it doesn't look like it, but when you talk to farmers, they start talking about sort of the plants that are gone, how dry it looks to them, how to them it's yellow, even though like, to me, it's green, but these are the sort of reasons that we want to work with communities and try and learn from them what's really happening with the climate, because they have this intimate knowledge. And so that's what I've just started doing here. And yeah, I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was the protests. Obviously, this is a big thing that's going on. I think worldwide people are looking at Israel right now. And it's definitely an interesting time to live here, although I will admit it's kind of hard being a foreigner during this time. There's the judicial reform, there's the National Guard or private militia, there's the anti-Bibi sentiment, very reminiscent of the Balfour protests. There's a lot of energy in society, and these protests are not happening once a week. They're almost happening every day in every part of every city. But what's interesting to me is that there's a bigger discussion starting in the Israeli media and in Israeli society about the character of Israeli democracy. And by that, I mean voices that have not been leaders before, and voices who have been kind of pushed to the side in the Israeli sort of larger narrative before, are starting to question, like, we don't just want to return to what we had before. What we had before included discrimination against us. And by that, I also mean amongst Jews, like the LGBTQ community, Mizrahi feminists, Ethiopian men who have been facing police violence here. Like, I mean, I think we know it's a complicated society here, and people are really starting to talk about these issues. And to me, it's like a really radical and watershed moment to be witnessing an Israeli democracy, like reimagining like what the society is going to look like. And obviously I don't know where it's going to go. But something else I did want to mention, which I think most international Jewish people aren't as aware of, is that in every one of these protests, there's a big anti-occupation bloc of young Jewish Israelis who are talking about the occupation and are asking it to be part of this picture. And they're saying that, it's important to also talk about the occupation and think about what it means to have democracy for everyone who's living on the land. And that's also just an interesting thing. And, they're bringing these signs about Masafer Yatta, this region I've been working in. And to me, it's really powerful to see people, doing all of this stuff. And a lot of them are good friends of mine. Yeah, so I guess some takeaways is that, environmental work is political. I learned that when I started my work in the Great Lakes, and that obviously carried me here. Coming from Canadian Jewish community, I did feel really ignorant about what was going on here, but I don't think that has to be the case. I think we can do like better, or maybe it's already better, about like really connecting with people and what's happening here. For me, at least, grassroots activism is a powerful method of creating change and building trust in new relationships. And I think that we have the chance to also retain Jewish spaces as places for discussion, debate, and dialogue. And I think a lot of the things that I've learned here and that I care about are really from this sort of Jewish learning and Jewish values that I learned when I was young. And I think they're really important when we think about this place and what we can do here. Yeah, and I think that's all I have. So thank you for listening, and I have my email here if people do want to ask me more in detail about anything that I talked about, or send sources or program websites. I'm happy to share. And yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Usually what we do is we turn to a quick Q&A at the end. And so there are two ways that people can ask questions. The first is just physically raising your hand, and I'll just look at the participants and see, or you can raise your virtual hand and we'll go from there. So does anyone
stop the share?
Totally up to you. If you want to keep your contact info, you can, or if we want to just see faces, it's whatever works best.
Okay, I'll leave it for a minute or two and then stop it.
Sounds good. Who wants to be the first to ask the hard-hitting questions? All right, I knew it. It would be Mark Levine.
Congratulations on a wonderful talk, and my hat off to you, and wonderful. I have one question and one comment. The first question is a goofy one. I saw you beside the water tank, and they must bring the empty water tanks in and then bring the water in by truck. So that means that the authorities, like the army, could stop water coming in. Is that correct, or have I got it wrong?
No, you got it right. Yeah. It's different. So the community of Khair is like the one that I have the picture of, and that we were working in primarily is on the edge of the firing zone. So it's technically not one of the communities that's going to be evacuated. It's facing issues of the settlement because it's in Masafriyata. But for the communities that are in like the actual firing zone, their exit is also, the exit of the road is through Khair. So there's a checkpoint they often put on the road that goes in and out of the firing zone. And yeah, that's where they can confiscate things. If that's what you meant.
That's what I was,
Sorry.
yeah. And the second is a comment based on your very, very nice how you knit together the politics, the environment, and social issues. And I was reading the newspaper in Hamilton this week, and it's fascinating. You've been away, but you may remember the sewer gate problem in Hamilton, where the not too far from the temple. Well, they still haven't cleaned it up because the First Nations people feel, some of them feel they've been left out. So when the city sent in the workmen to fix up, to start dredging and cleaning up, the First Nations people came in, and the workmen feel unsafe. So it's not getting done. So it's a beautiful example just in our community, very close to the temple, of the interaction of all these different forces. And I think if people sat down and thought about, oh, this is what's happening, let's talk about how we could deal with the social and political issues, and then we'd get the the sewer gate fixed up.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, thank you for saying that. I think I would say my experiences in Canada are also what shaped my understanding here. Like I think the world is, full of controversies and complex social dynamics, and it shaped what I can understand here, like, so much.
I have a question too.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Arielle, you were talking about the friendships among the different groups. I don't know if they were Jordanians, whether they were Israeli Arabs, as well as yourself and international students. And I'm wondering about the language that's the common language.
That's a great question. The program operates in English that I was in, and a lot of the activism in Masafriyata specifically happens in English, although I would say both of those are because of the international presence. And because both communities learn English, and so that becomes a shared language. More and more Israelis, especially in those communities, are learning Arabic. So that started to also come in. And a lot of the activism that happens here away from Masafriyata and just in general between Palestinians and Israelis happens in both languages, and they have like live translation. So, yeah.
And are Israelis learning, you said Israelis are learning Arabic, and it's not clear to me, are they Jordanians, or are they, do they identify as Palestinians? Are they learning Hebrew?
So Israeli Arabs or Palestinians, like, it depends on how they want to identify themselves. People change on their, their own identity or national identity. All know Hebrew, like from East Jerusalem, from the north. So they already speak Hebrew. In the West Bank, they don't for the most part, but a lot of the activists do speak Hebrew because they've learned it through interactions and like decades of friendship with Jewish Israelis. So there's a real mix of these languages. And honestly, I like smiled when you said that, because it feels very fluid. Like there's all the languages happening at once, which is
that's good.
Hard for me, but yeah.
Thanks. And thank you for an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Great start to our questions. I see a virtual hand by Angelique, please.
Hi, Arielle. Thank you. That was a really nice taste. I think I could listen to you for a lot longer than that, though. You said something about that it's difficult to be a foreigner right now, or especially difficult. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I think everything I've said today is obviously really rooted in my personal experience. So I really can't speak to how other internationals are faring here, other than like my friends who I talk to. I think it's like I said, it's really like there's this huge question happening about the state and about democracy and about what it means to be Israeli and whose democracy is it and all of this stuff. And I think it's really sensitive. And I think that's hard, in addition to the fact that there's just things are happening all the time and most of it's in Hebrew and it's hard for me to keep up. And also just that there's a big sentiment like, you don't know what's happening. You're just a Canadian girl. Not from everybody, but I think in terms of like when you start to get into the depths of Israeli politics, as anyone who's tried, there's about 1 million parties and there's a lot happening. So I think people have a sentiment of like, you're not really from here. So, it's not as like, you don't get it. And I think that is hard in any national moment to sort of be more of an outsider than normal, because it's really something that kind of every Israeli is really going through right now, is at least how I feel about it. Yeah.
Arielle, how much longer is your program that you're in?
So I just started. So it should be about 1.5 years, 2 years. Yeah. That I'll be finished. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you another question your parents might want to ask you. Do you expect to stay there afterwards?
I expect not to. I think it's a complicated place to live, and I have a lot of people I really care about here, but I also think I see myself living in Canada in the long term, but I do think this was really important exploration of my heritage and different things that I was interested in.
Well, good for you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. I'd love to hear a bit more about your perspective on how Israel's set itself up as a leader in environmental research and environmental protection, because I think we've seen that with agriculture and in different areas. So how's your experience been with that?
I think that's a really good question. I have way too much to say about it, so I'll try and think about what's most interesting. I think Israel's tech development in terms of agriculture is really astounding in terms of what they've been able to do. And I think that comes from sort of like the national Zionist character of like doing stuff as a collective. I think, they're definitely ahead of the game environmentally in terms of agriculture. Like you just don't like, I was honestly just in a class the other day with a professor who was talking about how in California during the droughts now, they're still flood irrigating farms, whereas here they've been doing drip irrigation for decades. So in that terms, I would say it's definitely just like this combination of sort of like tech and sort of the situation of being in the Middle East with a very dry climate and knowing that people were living in these different sort of settlements where there wasn't access to a lot of water. At the same time, Israel's famous for a lot of things in terms of planting trees and creating national parks and doing a lot of stuff that, while theoretically is good for the environment, has become problematic, both in terms of like environmentally and politically, because they did a lot of this stuff. I would say, wow, I'm going to get way too into it. I can say, for example, I'll say with the pine trees. Obviously, there's been tons and tons of tree planting happening in Israel for a long time. This has like a much longer story to it. But even on an environmental level, like the pine trees that they've been planting around Jerusalem have been catching fire for the last few years. I don't know if people are aware of that. that's because also of the drying out climate, but also because they're not actually indigenous to the region. And they were basically planted to sort of remind European Jews who were settling here of the European nature that they came from. And so because of that, they're starting to see like a lot of environmental consequences. And so I think like another great example of sort of these controversies around both doing a lot environmentally, but also maybe not always doing the right thing would be the drainage of the Hula Valley, which is considered one of the biggest sort of agricultural and environmental sort of things that allowed Israel to do a huge amount of farming in the north. But they drained Hula Lake and they drained the swamplands. And as we know, especially living in Hamilton, that swamplands and marshlands are super, super important for conservation and for maintaining biological diversity. And getting rid of them can have devastating consequences to ecology. And so I think there's a dual nature to like sort of Israel's infamous environmental work. Like for sure, their tech has been in terms of desalinization and all of this stuff really, really influences the world at large and has changed the Middle East drastically. But also they've done a lot of things that have really messed up environment and political landscapes here that I think they're only starting to see the consequences of now. So the story is kind of shifting in my view, but it's, you know, there's still time to see. And my mom's writing, to me. Oh no, to everybody.
She is. She says, I actually worked on a project looking at which fish were extinct because of the Hula Valley drainage.
Yeah.
Arielle,
And-
can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I feel like your experience being at the Arava Institute program was so transformative for you. And you talked about, and I think from in my imagination anyway, I think that the personal stories that you heard must have been so impactful. And I wonder if you could think of one in particular to share that really kind of moved you and expanded your way of thinking.
Bye.
Yeah.
You
Oi.
You know, I can't, you know, it's hard for me both to talk about it because so much of what we talked about is so personal that it's hard to know even, and also they're long stories, like people don't share their life story in a moment. So I think something that was like really impactful for me, not just me, but for everyone in the group was the fact that we would sit in a room and talk about like there were people who had served in the Israeli army and not just, I mean, most of the Israelis had, but that they had served a lot of them in the West Bank and the occupied territories, and that they had been the soldiers at checkpoints and they had been the soldiers doing night raids in the homes. And in the same room, there were Palestinians whose parents had been arrested by potentially the same soldiers, whose friends had been, you know, shot in a checkpoint, who's, you know, it was like, I don't know how to, you know, not become too like emotional about it, but it was a really hard experience to sort of sit through. And it, you know, it's not only easy. There were also people who, like Israelis whose family had died in different attacks, and Palestinians who had died. Like, you know, there's so much complications, but I think really the stories from sort of this duality of serving and living in the same area and the controversies the soldiers themselves like brought about their time there. Yeah, it was really, those were really hard. Like a personal story of like an actual person, I feel a little bit like I would need to think more.
No, that's okay. I also want to ask you, the pictures you showed where the Israeli settlement is right beside the community wanting to build subsistence agriculture with your project. I'm curious to know more about, we always hear about Palestinian violence. We don't often hear about settler violence, but you had it in your slides that's an issue. So, you know, what do you know about that? What kind of experiences has that community had?
In Khair specifically, right now, the relationship with Carmel is not particularly problematic. For years, it was quite violent, as in settlers would come and attack and tear up fields and different sort of violent activities. Today, not so much. It's considered one of the more tame settlements. I mean, it's quite old relatively. What's new in the area would be a lot of the outposts is where a lot of the violence happens. Outposts are sort of like the start of settlements. And young people tend to like move into them, and they're like more active in terms of burning, confiscating, throwing stones at cars.
What kind of consequences are there for settlers who are behaving so badly and immorally?
None. Like, I would say, like, there are obviously, basically when the settlers approach Palestinian communities or activists, the soldiers protect the settlers. Like, soldiers come to protect the settlers. There is the one consequence I can think of is that Tuba, which is one of the villages in the firing zone, and I can like send, if anyone's interested, I can send more, but there's an outpost settlement that sort of was like formed that cut off Tuba from the rest of, like, literally the rest of even Masafra Yatta, which is again cut off from every other part of the West Bank. And so the kids have to walk through the settlement to get to school every morning, like kids like under the age of 15. And they were getting attacked all the time by settlers, like 5-year-olds. And so what the Israeli government decided to do was basically to send a soldier jeep to escort them. And so they didn't like punish the settlement. They just offered, it's like one of the only cases of like the protection of Palestinian children by the army against the settlers. And I think I mentioned it, but this region particularly is nonviolent. So it really is only one-sided violence. I'm not saying there isn't violent resistance from Palestinians. Of course there is. We do hear about it, and it happens in other parts of the West Bank, but this area is actually completely practices nonviolence. So there's not even stone throwing from the Palestinians.
Thank you.
Who's next? I'd love to hear if Arielle's parents have any burning questions that they had. She read my mind. Are the settlers mostly from an international background? Sigal asks.
We've had this discussion before, I think. There are welcome to the family.
Yes.
I can't remember anything.
I think there are some of the outposts are like American Jews who come, and there's like this kind of like it's not so different than like the gun, like, it's like the classic sort of Republican vibe of like someone feeling like to carry the gun and like to walk around and like that it's their right to protect their property. Like you have this same sentiment also, and you do have some like Americans moving in. A lot of the settlers are people who have moved to the West Bank because it's subsidized housing. Like most of the like main settlements, like I think it's also like, now we're just getting into politics, so I don't need to talk about it too much, but it's subsidized by the Israeli government. It's cheaper for them to live there. So who lives there are like, it's a lot of Mizrahi Jews, it's a lot of Russian Jews, it's a lot of people who come from backgrounds that are underprivileged. And I think, this is a part of the story here that can't be ignored. It's not just like all settlers are evil and all people who live on the other side of there's no, black and white, I think, anywhere in the world, but especially here. So there's a mixture of backgrounds, but a lot of new immigrants are in the settlements, but they're not necessarily like internationals.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I liked your talk as well. I learned a lot that I didn't know about you, so thank you.
Thanks. Oh.
Well, since we've been prompted specifically, I'll ask a question too. I was trying to just stay in the background, but Arielle, most people, I think, many people in this group, no doubt, and more broadly in the Jewish community are simply unaware of the injustices that go on, particularly in the West Bank. And it's clear that just hearing you and in other contexts is a way forward. And like the first step has got to be to become aware. What do you have any particular suggestions for people, either the people here or when they're talking to their friends, about how people can become more aware? Because I don't think that, most of the Jewish community around the world is simply unaware and would be appalled and horrified by many of the things that are going on. What can we do? Do you have any suggestions?
I think it's not like super clear, straightforward. And I think obviously, like, again, I don't want to talk in black and whites about anything. There's not right and wrong. There's not people of light and people of darkness, aware and not aware. It's just a complicated situation that, we're all learning about all the time, that I'm still learning about. I do think that something that is important to think about, at least something I'm worried about, is that, young people who are involved in social justice movements and with the internet and with connection to a lot of other social justice causes, are becoming more aware of what's happening. And I don't think that the right mode is for them to feel disenfranchised by Jewish spaces. I want like Jewish values to stay connected to how we act and how we think about better worlds and better futures and relieving everyone from oppression and not just Jews. And so I think there's programs that we can do. I think there's institutes that we can follow. I think there's news we can follow. And I think that we can just open up that dialogue with young people in our communities, because I didn't feel like there was space to learn more. I think when I asked questions, people just didn't have answers for me. And I had to come here to find that out. And I think that's also fine, if you can. But if you can't, maybe there's a way to think about how we can open that discussion up more for young people and not be afraid of criticizing something that we're a part of in a lot of ways. That's how I feel about it.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Are there any last minute questions, burning desires anybody would like to get out? Yes. D. Physical hand. Perfect. You're on.
You had mentioned something about cowboys that you were going to get back to. Do you want to get back to them?
So in the Golan Heights, there are cowboys kind of in the style of cowboys from old movies in the American Wild West context. They also act that way and call themselves cowboys. So you can imagine the sort of vibe, I think. It's a really different landscape, obviously, than the sort of classic Wild West, but it's the attitude and it's the environment. It's part of the cattle industry here, like Golan beef. And the things that I'm interested regarding the cowboys, the bukrim, in Hebrew bukrim, is the dynamics around climate change and land and what's happening with their relationships with the state as shepherds, but also their relationships with the Druze community, who are also cowboys, although they don't call themselves they call themselves just cattle farmers, and sort of how all of this is playing out in this portion of what was once Syria is now annexed to Israel in the 80s. I don't have so much to say yet, but I'm happy to talk to anyone when I figure out more about the cowboys, but I've just started meeting them.
It would be nice to hear another presentation from you.
For sure.
Amazing. I think that is the perfect conclusion so that we can hear from you again later on down the road. So thank you so much for joining us all the way from Israel. That was really informative and really interesting. If anybody needs Arielle's number email with any questions, please let us know. And I'll do a little preview next week. Please join us to learn more about the field of education and what it looks like today. Rebecca Hout, Jack's, is it Mackover?
Yes.
I don't know how to say it. Okay, perfect. And Dora Ann Cohen will all be speaking next Sunday at 11 a.m.
Right. They're all elementary school teachers, so focused on pre-high school students, and they all teach in very different environments. So it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, and hope you enjoy your Sunday. And a special thank you to Arielle for joining us.
Arielle, we are so proud of you. Thank you so much for opening our minds today and sharing what you've been learning. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. It was really special to come and talk to everybody.
You're
And
really,
I'm really happy to continue over email with anyone who's
you're
interested
amazing.
more.
You are amazing. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.